Hi, I'm Janet Steele, founder and director of the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival. You are about to hear one of our highlight conversations recorded live for our 2022 festival, which explored the role of the written word in upholding humanity's values and freedoms through our festival theme, Mamayu Hayuning Bawana, Uniting Humanity. So please settle in and let the magic of our 19th festival continue.
Well, it is just such a pleasure to be here and to see everyone again, and it's just kind of unbelievable, isn't it? I actually don't even know that we need to introduce our author today. Michael Vatikiotis has been here, I think, as long as I've been here, and in fact, this is at least our third session together, and probably even more. You all know who he is, but I didn't realize he'd been a writer, broadcaster, and journalist in Asia for more than 35 years, which just shows how old we're getting, I guess. The last time we saw him here, he was presenting his book, Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia. He's also written a couple of novels, which I think we've talked about here, and he, as you know, is currently living in Singapore, working for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, a Geneva-based private foundation that facilitates dialogue to resolve armed conflicts. And today we are going to talk about his book, Lives Between the Lines, A Journey in Search of the Lost Levant. And I have a bunch of questions for him, but before I start asking him, I just want to say I think we could look at this as the latest chapter in an ongoing discussion that you and I have had about Southeast Asia and about your father and about how similar you are to him in so many ways in terms of your interests, previously with a different region, but now you have tackled his region too. So that's, to me, just fascinating. But maybe before we even do that, could I ask you please to define what the Levant is? Because I'm not sure everybody knows.
Thank you, Janet, and it is wonderful to be here in person at last. Thank you very much. I knew this was going to be a probing session with my father coming up again. The Levant is a region that encompasses what is commonly known as the Fertile Crescent, which, if you take a bead from southern Turkey down the coastline of Lebanon, Israel, Gaza, and down to the isthmus of the Suez, that's the coastline of the Levant. Inland, you've got Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Jordan, and Iraq, actually, are considered countries of the Levant. And Levantine was a term, slightly broader definition of people who lived in the Levant but weren't necessarily of the Levant. And this is where I think my family story comes in. I mean, lots of people moved to that area at a time of Ottoman rule, and it became, I think, the very definition of a cosmopolitan society. Mm-hmm. So the term Levant is a geographical term. It actually refers to the French of the rising of the sun, lever, and the term Levantine or Levantine refers to people who are from that region but not necessarily of the region. Right,
yeah. I actually looked this up, and I was a little bit confused, too, because it seems like there's not universal agreement on what the Levant even is, right? And it's sort of changed over time. When we use the term now, it's a little different from...
I think now it's more narrowly defined as the countries of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan.
Right.
If Israel wants to be considered part of the region, I think they would welcome that. Right. And I think the other thing to bear in mind, it's an incredibly small area of the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's possible to drive from Jordan, from Amman, up to Beirut in under 4 or 5 hours in peaceful times. And most people used the east-west route for trade to the coast of Palestine and Israel. So it's a very small part of the world as well. 70 million people today.
Wow, oh, I didn't realize that. Well, the thing this is a wonderful book, and there's so much stuff in that we could talk about. So I just picked out a few themes that I think this audience is going to be interested in, partly because they know you and are so interested in you. And if you want to learn about the real Michael Vatikiotis, you have to read his book, because it's got everything in it, so much family history. And do you want to tell us how you actually decided to write this, and what documents you had, and sort of your research plan before you started the journey, I guess in 2019?
Well, my late uncle, my mother's brother, had always encouraged me to take an interest in the family history. And my family, for those who've not yet read the book, it's essentially Italians from Egypt with an English grandfather, or Welsh grandfather actually, on my mother's side. And on my father's side, Greeks and Palestinians from Palestine. And so the book mainly takes place in Egypt and in modern-day Israel, with a chapter in Jordan, because my grandfather was posted there with the colonial service. I started the book really after being shocked and angered by the treatment of refugees coming from Syria and the Middle East from about 2012-13 onwards. And I started thinking about the book in those terms because my family were refugees from Europe to the Middle East. The mid-19th century was a time of great upheaval in Europe. The countries of Greece, modern-day Greece and modern-day Italy, were just evolving. And they were very violent places, much like the Middle East is today. There was the whole reunification of Italy, which involved a series of civil wars. And the Greeks fought a brief revolutionary struggle against the Turks, but as soon as they got themselves independent, they found they had no economy. And so my father's, my relatives on the Greek side who fought in the revolution ended up having to go and work for the very people they fought against in the Ottoman Empire. So it was this movement from Europe to the Middle East in the mid-19th century that fascinated me and is really very much a framing of the book, because the Suez Canal, when it was built in the 1860s, 50s and 60s, and it was opened in the late 1860s, was a magnet for people. It's hard to, it's really, if you look at modern day Dubai, you might sort of get the same sense, but it's really hard to underestimate how much of a magnet the Suez Canal was for people of all sorts of stripes and origins from Europe, the Mediterranean, and also coming up from southern parts of Africa. It was the largest importer of coal in the world, and Port Said, which is where my mother was born, at the mouth of the canal, was at one point the busiest port in the world.
Yeah. It is fascinating, the idea that the Ottoman Empire was this draw for people. I spent, as you know, 7 months in Serbia, and it had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and nobody has Ottoman nostalgia in Serbia. It's not like we think, oh, the good old days, the Ottoman Empire. But you actually learned a number of very interesting things about the Ottoman Empire. Could we dive right into those capitulations, which I'd never heard of?
So the Ottomans, I trace the origins of cosmopolitanism in the book, not just to the Ottomans, but to the Greeks and the Romans that preceded them. In many ways, it was Alexander the Great who broke the mold in ancient Greece by saying, well, we can't have people just belonging to cities because the world is too big. And if people just identify with a city, we're not going to be able to run an empire. So he created this notion that people could be from other places and still be citizens of a unified whole. Whereas the ancient Greeks, you were an Athenian, or you were a Spartan, and you usually fought wars against each other. And it was Alexander the Great, as he expanded into Asia, who said, no, this is ridiculous. I can't run an empire on that basis. Everyone has to intermarry. Everyone has to, my officials have to be from everywhere. The Byzantines took this up in Constantinople, and the later Roman Empire was very cosmopolitan as well. And then when the Ottomans arrived, the Ottoman Turks from Central Asia, they essentially took on this system. And they said, well, why create, a uniformity when in fact we can use the diversity at our sort of in our vast empire or growing empire at the time to run it. And that's exactly what they did. They took on the Byzantine Greeks, to run their bureaucracy very efficiently. And this eventually became, by the 15th century, a system whereby if you were a foreigner and you offered your services to the Ottoman Empire, you were given all the rights of citizenship, and you could do whatever you wanted. It didn't matter if you weren't a Muslim, just serve us and we'll look after you. And then by about the 16th, 17th century, they created this form of what they called capitulations, where essentially it was like a sort of a license to live under Ottoman rule in a protected way. Mm-hmm. So you could be a Greek, you could be an Armenian, and you were granted protection by the Ottomans to conduct your business. Mm-hmm. It was an extremely sensible, commercial arrangement. When the Jews were kicked out of Spain, the Ottoman Sultan at the time, famously said, well, "These idiots! Why did they kick them out? We'll use them." And he sent ships to pick them up from Spain. So it's that kind of sense in which, and this is the root of the cosmopolitanism, that yes, you were a second-class citizen if you weren't a Muslim, but you were protected. Right. And then later, by the 19th century, you were essentially protected by your consuls. If you were a Brit, or if you were an Italian, or if you were, you could be tried in your own courts in Egypt or in the Ottoman Empire, and you were protected by your own laws. And of course, later on, this was very much exploited by people. Right. And
didn't it have tax implications too?
Yes,
it's sort of a tax-free zone.
You were taxed, but you were taxed at a variable rate. Yeah. And in fact, if you could own land, you could do whatever you wanted. And in fact, what the Ottomans encouraged was people to live in what they called millets. So if you were a Greek Orthodox, like my father's family, you were entirely looked after by your community. You went to your own schools. The church was responsible in looking after that community. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's all gone now, of course.
Yeah. Well, no, it was fascinating. I never knew that the Ottoman Empire had these features because, again, in Serbia, we're glad we kicked them out.
Well, of course, many Serbians went on to serve the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
And actually were some of the worst, sort of most violent officials in the Ottoman army were the Serbs. And they, the Ottomans also had this system, which didn't affect my family, but they would take Christians and induct them into the army and convert them to Islam. Mm-hmm. And they became famous generals and leaders of the Ottoman army, and many of them were Serbs.
Yeah, that's in one of your footnotes. Like most books, this is a book written for a general audience, but it also has scholarly attributes, including great footnotes. And I read that footnote this morning and thought, oh, that is interesting. I mean, the book also has a couple of wonderful maps and family trees, which you do need in reading this because it's really the story of these two completely different groups, right? You're on your mother's side, they were Italian Jews, right? And quite wealthy, or they became quite wealthy. And then your father's family was not as wealthy and were from Greece. So it's quite a complex story, and there are a lot of ways we can enter it.
Well, so on the Italian side, which I think in many ways is the most, I would say, interesting for me as I was discovering in Egypt the role of the Italians. At one point, Alexandria in Egypt had almost 500,000 Italians.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just extraordinary. And they did everything. They built the city. They ran the railways. They ran, everything from small shops to big hotels. The Italians were the favorite professionals of the Ottoman era in Egypt under the Khedive Muhammad Ali, who was the great reformer. He himself wasn't Egyptian. I mean, I think that's a key thing. He was from Albania.
Yeah.
And so he arrived in Egypt and said, well, this country's a mess. I need to fix it. Let's bring in the Italians. So the Italians came in vast numbers. And, they would arrive in Alexandria, by boat. And the steamship was very important because they could arrive much more cheaply and efficiently from ports of Italy from the mid-19th century onwards. And they sort of basically built buildings. They were architects. They built all the palaces in Egypt. They were the artisans. They ran the theater, the opera. They were doctors. They were lawyers. I mean, everything. Right. And they were given protection under the capitulations and what later became called the mixed courts. I had a great uncle who was a lawyer in the mixed courts, and their job was to defend Italians. Meanwhile, all these Italians, after the unification of Italy, they became Italian. they acquired Italian citizenship because that was where your protection came from. There was absolutely no pressure or incentive to integrate.
Right.
And I think this is one of the fascinating discoveries for me. There was no integration at all for the Greeks, the Italians, the Maltese. They just stayed Greeks and Italians, Maltese.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because, and you made a reference to it a minute ago about cosmopolitanism. And when you're using a pretty precise definition of this,
Yes.
right? Do you want to tell us how you're defining cosmopolitan?
It's very much in the Ottoman mold, which, as I said, has precedents going back into ancient times, where people can belong to a city, the polis, the city, but they don't actually have to be of the city. And there's no pressure to sort of identify with the place other than where you come from and what you do.
Right.
And this led to, of course, a specialization. I mean, in the Holy Land, in Palestine, in the sort of pre-British era, the church was incredibly powerful, the Greek church, because the Ottomans empowered the Greek church to look after the Christian community. And the Greeks were always in charge. Catholics were kind of down there. And the Greeks acquired huge amounts of land as a result, because everyone gave the church the land so it wouldn't be taxed by the Ottomans. So in fact, in modern-day Israel, one of my favorite facts in the book is that almost 1/3 of the land of modern Israel is actually owned by the Greek church.
Which is fascinating, and I want to get to that, but it's interesting. I really was struck by the definition of cosmopolitan. You say there's a common misunderstanding about the meaning of cosmopolitanism, which people take to mean intermarriage and intermingling. In fact, cosmopolitanism in the Middle East context comes closer to the classical definition of pluralism. As defined in Southeast Asia by the colonial era British economist John Furnivall, who observed that people of different races and religions mixed but did not mingle in the marketplaces of the Dutch East Indies and British Burma. And I thought this audience would be really interested in that.
And there's a story there which I didn't really go into in the book, but as a graduate student in Southeast Asia, I was drawn to study pluralism. And I've often wondered why. So why was I drawn to study pluralism? And it only later struck me when I was doing the book, well, of course, I come from a plural background.
Exactly. And Michael, I think everybody who reads this book is going to say, of course he wrote this book, because it's all about his family, and it's all about his life and the connections between the life of your family in the past, the life of your father, which is really important, I think, in the book. I'm not making this up. And then your life, the life you've chosen.
But on pluralism, I think it's important to point out that these were exploitative mechanisms. I mean, in the colonial context in Southeast Asia, the British, Burma, Indonesian, Dutch Indonesian meaning of pluralism or intention of pluralism was to ensure that there was social control. So you didn't want the different communities to mix and mingle because you actually wanted them to be separate so they would be easier to govern and easier to exploit. And actually the Turks did the same thing in a way. They said, we don't want everyone to be one body of citizens. In fact, the decline, some scholars would actually date the decline of the Ottoman Empire, ironically, from the period in the 1830s and 40s when they started to reform the Ottoman Empire and modernize it and give it a constitution so that everyone was a citizen. And the Arabs sort of said, we don't want to be a citizen of the we don't want this. We actually are very happy with you treating us as different entities. And when the Turks started to realize that to compete with Europe, they had to form, if you like, a body of citizens. That's when the Arabs joined the British in the First World War and said, we don't want that.
It's still interesting to me, though, mixing but not mingling, that doesn't...
It's an arrangement.
Yeah.
It's an arrangement. But I think in the Southeast Asian context, we often use the term casually to imply it's a good thing, because it means that everyone is tolerant of one another. But we have to remember that in the colonial context, it was exploitative.
Right. Well, the way I always thought of it is the willingness to assume different identities, which I think is also in not allowing yourself to be defined by any single identity. And you have some, that seems to be Levantine, but that seems, at least in the book, that's the working definition of Levantine, refusing to allow yourself to be identified with any single identity.
I think
But that's different from cosmopolitanism as this sort of mixing, not mingling.
Well, so as a result of that cosmopolitanism, the Levantine culture that emerged was one where I describe in the book, and I borrow it from actually a British novelist's description of a Levantine, classic Levantine, saying that I actually am a committee of different identities. Yeah. And the committee is always arguing over which one of them should, and I myself do that. I mean, I sort of, what identity should I use? Right. And when I go to the Middle East, I was just in Jordan 2 weeks ago, and my Arabic is terrible, but the sensibility always comes out. So that people just assume I'm from the region because of that sensibility. Yeah. You project that sensibility. And, when I'm in England, it's terrible. I mean, I'm not very good at the English part, actually. Mm-hmm. I went to all these English schools, and I kind of learnt how to be English very well, actually. Yeah. I mean, I could do it quite well for short bursts. But, it was quite difficult. And I realized, again, in the course of writing the book, just how much of other identities were being imposed on me and others, actually, who were dispersed from that part of the world and had to acquire a new form of identity which didn't quite fit in with the sort of Levantine sensibility. Right.
Yes. I love how this is a complete aside, but I guess it's when you're in Palestine that there's an idea that you are Indonesian because somebody read somewhere associated you with Indonesian, and so
I was looking for my great-grandfather's grave in Acre, which is an old crusader town, and is a beautiful part of the world, set in a sort of natural bay, and the cemetery is just right there. And I had enlisted the help of a poet, a Palestinian poet. Palestinians helped me throughout this journey to sort of connect me with various people. And this guy comes up to me and he says, "You Michael?" I said, "Yes." It was all on a sort of mobile phone. Yes. He said, "Okay, I will connect you with the cemetery manager," and so on. And he was shouting in the phone, and there's this man from Indonesia. He wants to look for his great-grandfather. But I thought that was fine.
Yeah. Well,
one of my identities.
Another example of these confusing identities. Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an interesting book because you can read it on so many different levels. You can learn all about, the way the Ottoman Empire ran things, but there's also so much about you and your observations about all of these places and tracing this family history that I gather when you were growing up, you knew about it, but the family didn't really talk about it much. There's this sense of you're discovering all these things now that were around, but...
Well, I make the distinction. I mean, I grew up in England. It was really difficult in England, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, well, 70s in particular, to be different. And I think I make the reference to the fact that in the country of my actual birth, in the United States, if I'd stayed in the United States, I think I would have been much more aware of the diversity, because that's, of course, what happens in many communities. And I have vivid memories of the Greek community where I was born. They were all very clannish and held together. But in England, you couldn't do that. Not in the 1970s. I mean, it's improved and now it's got worse again. But there was a really strong imperative to assimilate, more so than arguably in the United States, if you were in those communities. So I did grow up with a sort of suppressed, and of course my mother and father were both trying to be, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which they weren't. Right. Because that's, my father was trying to fit in to the community, to the academic community. He never really fitted in either in the United States or in the UK. He was never really happy. Yeah. He could never express himself. And I grew up with these memories of him shouting down the phone in Arabic, and being really happy when his friends would come to the house and he could cook Levantine food. And, otherwise we lived this kind of rather artificial existence in a sort of leafy London suburb.
Yeah. Now your father did leave a memoir, is that right?
And, he did. It was very brief.
Yeah, and then, you make an observation. You say he confided his more candid thoughts in fiction.
He did. So much later, having used the memoir as the base, and it was really very thin, and he didn't go into great detail. I think he was mainly trying to leave a political testament in a way. And he was an academic. He was a professor at London University and of Middle Eastern studies, and so everything was sensitive. And much later on, when I started researching the book, I discovered a sheaf of documents, because he died 20 years ago. And this was a series of short stories that he wrote for publication, but they were rejected. And all the stories are about him in various stages of his childhood and adolescence. And the stories actually tell very, very vividly of his encounters as a child growing up in Palestine, then as a teenager, then as an adolescent, and then as a student in Egypt. At a very interesting time, 47, 48, where there was lots of anti-British protests and so on. And the characters in the stories are actually real characters.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So and I had to sort of piece it all together from a diary he kept, where there was some reference, and then something that he mentioned in his very sort of meager memoir about people he knew, and then I sort of triangulated with the short stories, and there was this whole treasure trove of material.
How interesting. Well, okay, we have to ask, I mean, you are also a scholar, a public intellectual who has written fiction. Is it true, do you also confide your more candid thoughts to fiction, you think?
I know. I think he felt that, the only way he could talk about some of the more... I mean, my father was very close to the founding members of the PLO, so, and his grandmother was Palestinian, but he was mostly Greek. But he went to school with a whole bunch of Palestinians who went on to establish the movement. And he always called it the movement. And he was a sympathizer. But professionally, he never wrote a word. Not one word about Palestine.
Well, you mentioned these phone calls. It sounded like a lot of his contacts were his old friends from the PLO. But I'm curious about, I mean, you have written academic or scholarly public intellectual work on Southeast Asia, but you've also written novels and short stories about Southeast Asia. Do you feel you can be more candid in your fiction than, is it the same thing?
I think for me it was about, in one of the novels particularly, being able to pretend I was an artist. So because I've always wanted to paint.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, your I can't remember the title of it. The story about the conflict in the Moluccas. Yes, and I'm trying to remember. But when you wrote that, were you able to say things in that novel that you couldn't really say? I mean, as I recall, like you've got the military pretty clearly behind one group, and I don't know that you could just come out and announce that as Michael Vatikiotis.
And I think that's what also makes for bad fiction sometimes, because as journalists, we want to tell real stories, and we sort of thinly disguise them in a fictional framework. And so I think I feel personally I did a much better job in the second novel set in Central Java, where I really just took a story and made it up, rather than Maluku, which was about a real story with thinly disguised characters. So I mean, it's always, I think,
it's a good story, and it actually, probably like your father's fiction, it does have a lot of insights into what was really going on in that conflict.
And as I always tell fellow writers and people who aspire to be writers, fiction is a great training ground for narrative nonfiction.
Yeah. And that's what this is, I think, and it's very well done. I was struck by the sort of Ottoman nostalgia, because again, that's not something we often hear. But the other thing is sort of Levantine nostalgia, that you try really hard to be even-handed about this, that you point out that I find the quotes, that the Levantine community was the linchpin of economic activity in Egypt. They had capital, expertise, connections, but there was nothing about the Levantine era that ever did much for the average Egyptian. So you say that.
And it became quite troubling for me, conscience-wise, as I discovered the artifacts, the remnants of my mother's family's great wealth, actually. I mean, my great uncle on my mother's side was the owner of a massive ceramics industrial complex on the outskirts of Cairo. That is very famous. If you say Sornaga ceramics in Egypt, everyone goes, "Yeah, I have the tiles, my floor, my
and
wall."
This design is this?
Yeah, this
is one of their designs. Okay.
And he was an Italian who basically my great grandfather was in cotton ginning, because the interesting thing about the Italians in business in Egypt is that they took on the cotton business, which of course came to Egypt because of the American Civil War, and there was no more cotton going to the mills of Lancashire, so Egypt stepped in, and then the Italians stepped in a big way, and they were all in cotton ginning, and my great uncle migrated to ceramics, and enormously successful. The factory is still there. In fact, the army is now turning it into a holiday resort for whatever reason.
The factory or the villa?
The factory and the villa. The factory is next door to the villa.
Okay.
So, and I started to look, and of course when I went there and I met former workers from the company, they all said how well they were treated by my uncle. You know, we had electricity, we had good housing, we had everything. You know, why doesn't he? When I arrived at the factory, they said, "Have you come back to buy it?" And I go, "No," because so I was torn a little bit between obviously the propaganda in my mother's family, which was they looked after the Egyptians and they sent them to school and they trained them and so on. But the fact is that this layer of society, the Italians, the Greeks. I mean, the Greeks were particularly exploitative because they had all the businesses that lent money to the Egyptians up and down the Nile Delta. They had all the mom and pop stores that served as lending facilities, and of course they became the Egyptians became indebted to them. Yeah. And of course, when in the 1950s Nasser came along and said, "This is our revolution. We're going to rid ourselves of the shackles of colonialism," it wasn't just the shackles of British colonialism, which defined itself in this rather sort of vague, what do they call it, the veiled protectorate. But it was also that economic layer that was run by foreigners. Right. And they all had to leave. And they were not supposed to leave with their wealth. They had to sort of hide their wealth in gold sovereigns and things. But so I think the family, in my Italian side, they were always very torn up about this. They felt that they had been good to the Egyptians. They felt that they had contributed to the Egyptian economy, which they did. Right. But there's no denying. And before my mother died this year, actually, and before she died, we would talk about this, and she said, "Yeah, come to think of it, and my uncle in Rome would say the same thing. It was awful. The inequality and the disparity between us and the rest of the population was enormous."
Yeah, you write about that. You write about social class and how these were just complete elites. Their lives were fantastic, and so it's interesting because you try to be really even-handed about this.
And then in modern Egypt, of course, it's got even worse because the army has become a superclass. Right. The Egyptian bourgeoisie that took over in the 60s. Essentially became even more rapacious. Right. So the poor Egyptians at the end of the day never had their salvation.
Right. But there still is this sort of sense of nostalgia for this beautiful belle époque of the time and the gorgeous buildings and the fantastic life, but it really wasn't connected to...
No. Yeah. And nor was it in Palestine necessarily either, because again the Ottoman system kept people in their different boxes.
Right. I'm curious. Was your mother's family, were they observant Jews or just cultural?
No. That's also a very interesting story thread through this book, which is the Jewish communities, not just the Italians. Were not Zionists by and large. In fact, there's one of the saddest stories in the book, which I tell, is of my mother's second cousins who casually went back to Italy in 1943. They were all fascists, by the way.
Yeah. I know. I was going to ask you about that too.
My mother's family were pro-Mussolini. They believed in the Italian monarchy because they'd been supporters of Garibaldi and so on. So when this second cousin and his wife and young child went back to Italy in 1943, they had no idea about the the Nazi campaign against the Jews, and they were hounded by the local mafia who threatened to shop them to the Gestapo until they committed suicide. So it's a dreadful, dreadful story. But what it really highlights is that these Jews, first of all, they were pro-Mussolini, and to be fair, though, the Italian fascist state was never as anti-Semitic as the Nazis were, and many Italians protected the Jews.
Right. Yeah, it's a very different story in Serbia, which is really just right down the road, which is fascinating to me too.
If you go to the ghetto in Rome today, the old ghetto, in fact, it's full of plaques which show how the Italians, they obviously promote this, did protect many members of the community. And Garibaldi, when he was leading the revolutionary struggle to establish the Kingdom of Italy, unified kingdom, he emancipated the Jews, and brought them into the movement. And my great-grandfather was a Garibaldini, because he felt, we can, again, like the Ottomans, we can use them. They're very clever people. They're good in, well, let's bring them on side. Yeah. So it's a complicated story in Italy, and I don't know, I've never really seen it properly told. But when they arrived in Egypt, of course, there was a pre-existing Jewish community that was actually very devout. And, you know, they were Sephardic Jews, like my mother's family, but Sephardic the other way around. And they didn't really connect.
Right.
And my mother's family married into Catholics. And my mother was raised a Catholic because my English Welsh grandfather was a Catholic. So it's a sort of religion really wasn't, and it's part of that whole cosmopolitan identity. It was flexible. You used it variably,
right.
You know, when you needed to.
Well, certainly on your mother's family, but your father's family I was also so interested in the Orthodox Church, and that they own so much land in Jerusalem. Is this something we all know? Or is this a...
The Catholics very much know this.
Okay.
So my the two favorite characters of mine in the book are my two great uncles who were monks in the Greek church, who were brought to Palestine in the late 19th, early 20th century because they had money. Yeah. And the reason why the Greeks was suddenly realized they were losing out to the Catholics, and particularly to the Franciscans in Bethlehem. And so they put out this call. They said, all Greeks with money, come, we'll put you in the church right away and go and buy land and set up and rebuild monasteries. So all these Greeks came, they did a sort of training course in Mount Athos, and they came to the Holy Land and they invested their own money in buying the land of ruined monasteries and rebuilt them so that they could fend off the other Protestant and Catholic interlopers.
Now, again, from my admittedly limited Serbian perspective, I tend to think of the Orthodox Church as being really conservative, really politically conservative. Is that the case was that what you found? Or?
What I discovered, and I had fantastic meetings with the hierarchy of the Greek Church in Jerusalem, which is fiercely independent of the Greek state, of the Greek Church in Constantinople or Istanbul, and they consider themselves to be primus inter pares. You know, we run the holy sites.
Well, they
everyone
own
else
them. They own the Church of the
everyone
Holy
else
Sepulchre,
is
right?
subordinate to us.
Yeah.
And it's not a particularly conservative church. It's a money-making business. They make money out of the pilgrims. They own the land. They take rent. And in fact, in the old city, you can actually talk to owners of some of the shops who say, yeah, they're putting the rent up, you know. I mean, it's a church. Why are they doing that?
Do they, in Serbia, the Orthodox Church there supports Putin. There's all the, Slavic Brotherhood, the invasion of Ukraine they support. I realize this is after your book, but what do you think about the Orthodox Church?
Well,
the Greek Orthodox Church, is it like Putin crazy too?
No, there's been very much a split between the Greeks and the Russians, which is a good thing.
But there are lots of Russians in Jerusalem now, right?
And the sad thing is that the Russian Orthodox, as I document in the book, and the Romanian Orthodox, they actually form the majority of pilgrims now. I mean, they're intensely religious societies, and they have the means to conduct the pilgrimages. The Greeks in Greece have lost faith in the church. I mean, they've become very modern Europeans, or rather cynical towards the church. But the Romanians in particular, but the Russians as well, Ukrainians included, are intensely devout. When they go to the Holy Land, they do all the sites. And so I went to one of these monasteries that my great-uncle, one of my great-uncles rebuilt, and the abbot there was complaining. He said, there's too many Russians, too many Romanians. I said, what's wrong with that? They're coming, they're paying you good money to come in. Yeah, but they're not the same. It's like, but the other story is the Israelis. The church in the Greek and Russian church in the Holy Land actually relies on the Russians to protect them from the Israelis, because Putin is very influential, or at least was. And that's still a problem today for the Americans, because they want Israel to be sending, the Iron Dome missiles to Ukraine, and the Israelis kind of rely on Putin because he protects their flank in Syria. Yeah. So it's
really complicated. It's really complicated, and I know the audience has a bunch of questions, and we'll let them ask stuff in a minute. But why did it all fall apart? Can you kind of give us it's not a happy ending story, as one of my friends said. So why did it all fall apart?
This, exploitative as it may have been, a rather halcyon area in the Middle East, where there was great prosperity, there was economic development, there was very little sectarian strife. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, whether you regard it as exploitative or not, religions rubbed along, and you didn't have the sectarian issues that you have today.
Right.
And that all started to fall apart when the French and the English came after the First World War and divided, and hence the title.
The title, yeah.
Lives Between the Lines. They partitioned the region in ways that enhanced and exaggerated identity issues. The city of Jerusalem, for instance, wasn't really divided into quarters until General Allenby ordered it to be so.
Yeah.
The Jews must be here and the Arabs must be here. He ordered, Indian Muslim guards to guard the Dome of the Holy Rock, when in fact the Jews had gone in there and played football and so on. So there was all this partitioning going on.
Yeah.
And that sort of began the whole corrosive process of the different communities not being able to coexist. And then, of course, 1948, the formation of the State of Israel, which really upset the apple cart, because it created a huge exodus from Palestine, and then quickly followed by the anti-colonial movements in Egypt and later in Iraq and Syria that basically created that sense of Arab nationalism,
right.
which then reinforced the division between the communities.
Right. Yeah, the British really come off just like sort of clueless here. I mean, at one point you point out that the Balfour Declarations promised the Jews a homeland at the same time that the McMahon commitments were promising Arab self-determination. And how could they think both of these things would be possible?
Yeah, and to be fair, at several points the British government tried to roll back. There was the famous Peel Commission in the 1930s, which said this is not going to work.
Yeah.
And then the Americans actually, many people would argue that if Woodrow Wilson had not died of a stroke in 1919, there would have been more insistence on the British and the French not to conduct themselves this way. And in fact, later on with the Suez Crisis, when the British and French invaded the Suez Canal, it was the Americans who sort of rolled them back.
Yeah.
And there was more of this idealism.
Right.
And another footnote, which was very interesting, was the King Crane Commission that was commissioned by President Wilson to ask the people of Palestine and Syria, what would you want? And no one wanted a divided community.
No two states, yeah.
And of course no one listened. But the other problem is that I think that we have come to see the Middle East purely through that lens.
Right.
And I was in Jordan 2 weeks ago and working on trying to actually build a platform for Levant cooperation and similar to, they want a sort of similar kind of regional cooperation body to what we have here in Southeast Asia. And they feel the time has come where the Levant countries can, despite decades of war and conflict, where they can actually start to come together again. And I think there's a promise now that, if they can restore those people-to-people ties, they speak the same language, they have the same history, they have the same culture, they have the same food, the same music, then there's some hope for the region to rebuild a sort of a more collective, harmonious society. But it's taken 70 years.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the chapters on the sort of post-48 mess, and that was your father's milieu and how he met all the later leaders of the PLO. And I guess one of his most famous books is called Among Arabs and Jews, which is also the title of your chapter on that, which I liked. That was a nice touch. But that really seemed to be the milieu that made your father who he was, and his interests, academic interests, then in his career.
Yeah, and there was just simply no there was no solution to any of this. I mean, I remember my father telling me when I was young, he said, there's just never going to be, and that explains why I went to Southeast Asia to some extent, because I remember I wanted to study Arabic and I wanted to do Middle East studies, and because I was kept hearing from him how awful it was, I just sort of said, well, I want to go to a part of the world where there's some hope.
Right, right.
And I remember him sort of finally saying to me as I was leaving, he said, well, why are you going there? I said, well, because, there's some hope. He said, well, but it's an uncivilized part of the world. I said, well, but, your part of the world is not exactly civilized either.
Right.
So we had a sort of falling out over that.
Well, there is this theory in anthropology, that when the island gets too crowded, the sons have to go over to a new island and create the society there. And so it strikes me as that's sort of what you did too. All right, your dad among the Arabs and the Jews in the Middle East, and you're going to go out to Southeast Asia, because your dissertation was on Thailand too, right?
On pluralism.
Yeah.
So I've always been sort of working towards writing this sort of study of cosmopolitan pluralism.
I think so. Well, I think all of you are going to love this book. If you love Michael, you'll love the book. And even if you're not remotely interested in the Ottoman capitulations, there's an awful lot of stuff in here that you will be interested in. Just his insights into what all of these places are like. It's really fun. So, questions from you? Yes, Renee, first hand up.
Michael, I just wanted to know if there is any chance that we can see your dad's short stories and memoir come to print.
Well, the memoir was published in 1991 in London, and it's out of print. But the short stories, I'm actually thinking of trying to get published in Beirut, at the American University in Beirut.
Okay, yes, in the back.
Tony.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Can you explain the difference between mixing and mingling culturally?
You know, I was afraid of that question. I mean, those are the words that Furnival used in colonial Burma. But what he really meant was the difference between intermarrying and integrating with one another and mixing in the marketplace. So they meet in the marketplace, was his definition, to do trade. But they don't actually intermarry and integrate. That was his meaning by the difference between mixing and mingling.
Was there intermarriage in your family? Did anybody marry?
Yes, I have this whole Arab part of the family. My grandfather's side on my father's side, because his mother was Palestinian, and he had cousins who essentially went off into the new, if you like, Arab world of the Gulf. In the 60s and 70s and in the 50s and 60s and married. And so my father always used to think, well, he must have cousins, second cousins, as well as first cousins in places like Kuwait. I think we found some people in Kuwait. But the families were never joined. Right. Because my grandfather, who was an Arab by sensibility and very much hated the fact that he had to leave Palestine and modern Israel, he arrived in Greece, a country that the only country he could go to in 1954, and he described himself as a refugee from Palestine in Greece. And it was very sad, I think, that he never really integrated in Greece.
Right. Did you have a question? And
Tony.
then Tony. Tony, you want to? Yeah.
Michael, what are your languages? Your mother tongue, for example. You sound so quintessentially English.
Yeah.
But you must have grown up hearing the massive languages as a baby. Tell us a little about your language.
So my mother tried to, my mother and father, classically in those sort of mixed marriages, the common language was English. My father didn't speak good Italian, and my mother, Italian was her first language and English was her second language. And my father spoke Arabic as a native, but my mother only spoke kitchen Arabic, which is unfortunately what happened in Egypt with the foreigners. They didn't really learn Arabic as well as they should have or could have. And so the common language was English. My father did make an effort to learn Italian, and my mother did try to teach me Italian when I was young, about 10 to 12 years old, but it was after school. What do you want to do after school?
Right.
Do you want to learn a language, or you want to go off and, anyway, so play with Lego. My Italian is awful, but I comprehend about 60-70% of Italian and a lot of Greek. My father also tried to teach me Greek, back to the American context. In America, where I was born, I grew up going to Sunday school in the church, the Greek church. When I got to England, no Greek church, no Sunday school.
Right.
And so, again, a lost opportunity.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Go ahead. No, go ahead, and then Pam.
First, it's just a very practical question. Is this book available on Kindle?
Yes, it is. And I did an audio version myself.
Wow.
Which is a new thing. Authors are asked to do their own audio version, and I spend a lot of time doing that.
Oh,
Well, for what you told us, you are the incarnation of the cosmopolitan.
Yes.
And I find it incredibly interesting that you, with your background, know so much about your family, your uncle, great-uncle, great-grandfather. I was raised in Germany. I'm Bavarian. I have no idea what with my great-great-grandfather did or what my great-uncle did. No idea.
Is that because your parents weren't interested in
some way, it looks like your multicultural upbringing is, how would I say?
Stimulated that interest.
Gives you more chances to understand where you are, who you are.
That's a great observation.
There were many more questions than perhaps someone who comes from one place with one set of parents from one community. Maybe there are just fewer questions that you were asking.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't know anything. I don't know what my great great uncle did. Your great uncle, by the way, was quite a character with all of his mistresses and, but a solid family man too. It's just fascinating.
Yeah. So,
Pam.
Tony, did you have? Oh, Pam had a question. Yeah, Pam.
I've just been wondering. Thanks, Michael. That was fascinating. If we have a cosmopolitan society, a truly cosmopolitan society, what's the role of the state then, and nationalism? How does that play out?
You know, that's a really good question about the Ottoman system, because, as I said, when the Ottoman system modernized and became a truly modern state, it started to fall apart because they simply couldn't balance the ability to tolerate multiple different communities doing their own thing with a modern state. And I quote one of my great heroes in literature, Albert Camus, who in about 1945 or 46, the war had just ended, the Second War. I think before the end of the war, maybe in 1944, bearing in mind that Camus was from Algeria. He was a North African, basically, from a former Ottoman land. And he blamed the whole conflagration in Europe on modern nationalism. He said, no, it's the modern nationalist state. It's this forcing of people to adopt an identity behind different lines that is causing all this mayhem. If we had this more universalistic notion of communities as a cosmopolitan whole, we wouldn't have that. We wouldn't be fighting. And there's a point to that. And the modern Ottoman Empire, which collapsed in 1920, I think finally in 27, it was brought about by their efforts to reform and emulate Europe.
Yeah. I wonder, Indonesia versus Malaysia, and how Indonesia handles, sorry, I feel like I'm really loud now, how Indonesia handles race and ethnicity versus how Malaysia does. Is this related?
So the Malaysian form of pluralism much more emulates the sort of Fernivalian, keep people apart, and it becomes reified in political terms. Right. Indonesia, I think, I've reflected a lot on Indonesia in recent years because of what's happening elsewhere in the world. What a lucky country, that they rejected federalism, that they decided to impose a minority language on the majority of Javanese, and they are a thoroughly modern state. I recently spent time in the Horn of Africa working, and there's a lot of federal systems in Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia. None of them work. This whole promise of federalism, that somehow if you're a Tigrayan and an Amhara, you'll rub along with some arrangement in legal terms. Doesn't work. In complex societies like Indonesia, it simply wouldn't work.
Right.
It's much better to have a unitary state, but then to have a cultural, if you like, form of identity that doesn't try to impose too much on people.
Right.
And also this modern sense of being a nation. So I get very, recently I think the FT did an article on Indonesia saying, a surprising success. So what's surprising? They got it right to begin with. And I look at what's happening in countries, awful things that are happening in certainly those African federations. I mean, Nigeria being a case in point. It's simply not working. They're failed states. So yes, I mean, I think Indonesia and much of Southeast Asia has managed to fuse the best elements of pluralism with modern forms of nationhood without having to set up these kind of artificial arrangements.
Right.
You know, where, I mean, Thailand's another good example where there's diversity disguised by a sort of unitary kingdom. But they tolerate the diversity. They just don't recognize it openly. And so, and it's fluid, and people can choose to move in one direction or another. But it has, of course, caused problems too, as we know. I mean, religion became a major factor and this is what we see happening in India today, which was working tolerably well until the Hindu nationalists come along and say, well, we want Muslims to leave. So, you know, it's not all perfect.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. My great-grandfather came from China, and they sailed and landed at Flores. And my mother and father was born at Flores. And my teenager and adulthood, I grew up outside Flores at several cities at Java. So it is interesting, like genetically, my DNA should be, majority is China, right? And I think I blend very well because I think I am more Indonesian than China. So it is interesting with Michael, but genetically you are mixed up from so many. And my question is like, how we face racism, but like genetically, people think like, oh, you from this race, but the culture, I think we must separate genetically and the culture and citizenship of. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So, and of course it's changing. You know, I mean, I think for your generation and even younger, it's a different thing from what it was my generation and before. And I think that the way in which people now view identity, there's very much a growing divide between, I think, Europe and Asia. And Asia, I think, still has a greater sense of tolerance and forbearance for genetic diversity and race, whereas much of what I see happening in the Western world is partly out of misplaced notions of identity and guilt. There's an increasing sort of notion of color and race in the way people define themselves, even if it's actually not a factor. So I've told a story to several friends here already of a friend of mine who's Syrian. And she's a writer, and she was asked in England, why is she writing about Syria? She's too white to be Syrian. No, I'm going, there's a sort of fundamental misunderstanding about that. And in this part of the world, in the Middle East, you know, color is more a factor of whether you work outside and go brown. You know, the Italians, when they first went to America in the late 19th century, they were mostly poor farmers from southern Italy, and they were treated as coloreds. But of course, if they had all lived indoors like their Tuscan relatives, they would all be white. So my family were from Tuscany. They didn't work outdoors. So I think that what's happening today, though, is I see a decline in this prejudice towards, I mean, you're of Chinese ancestry. I don't hear this as much today as you would, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I don't know.
I think we have to end on that optimistic note. Thank you so much, Michael. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much.